Old Path in our study through the Old Testament. We are currently in the book of Second Chronicles. We get to chapters 22 and 23 today, and as we look through this, before we get to the text, these two chapters, I think it's a good time to stop and remember kind of the beginning of the Kings. And I want to do it as a way of contrast by looking at the narrative and the history that we're going to read about here in these two chapters. Remember at the beginning, we know that the idea of a king was not something that God really wanted for the children of Israel. It's not how he wanted to see them led. And the first person that was chosen was Saul. We all know how his life was. And when God had the opportunity to choose, what he gave to them was really kind of a prototype in the person of David. On the personal level, he made plenty of mistakes that we would look at, kind of a man of, I guess you could say, of passions. But at the same time, this was a man who never led the nation astray. So he's kind of the one by whom all are measured. And the promises that God gave in the forever sense were given through David and through his line. So if you think of it in those terms, God didn't want them to be led by a king, but since king was what they had decided on, he at least gave them what I would consider as a standard in the person of David. We've been studying recently, if you remember, just in the last few weeks, we've gone through a part of the Kings where we were introduced to a man named Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat had his, I guess you could say, blind spots that he would have on the family side of things, but also another king who never led the nation astray and was always sensitive to the things of God. Now here we are in these two chapters here, and we're looking at kings and the mother of one of the kings, and look at how bad things have become in Judah, that they've gone from a person like David who was really appointed by God, anointed by him to be the king, and now you have people who are just taking it by force, and they're murderers, and they're also people who are idolaters, and they've completely abandoned the Lord. And I think it's just a very striking bit of history. Something very important for us to remember is how quickly you can go from the life of Jehoshaphat to his direct descendants after him had become just unimaginably wicked. And they had murdered their way into their position and they would do it just as quickly to try to maintain it. And so these are people who meet violent ends. And so I think it's instructive for us to recognize, once again, that God will bless and be with those who are sensitive to him. And in this case, he appointed people at times and really blessed their endeavors. But for those that would reject him, not only could they not expect his help in their work and the things that they would do, but he would be in a place of opposition against them. And there would be no protection, there would be no covering for them coming from him. And here we have great examples of that. So this is intriguing to me, that this part of their history of the kings, though certainly not the ideal that God had. It was not the best of ways, so it wasn't the ideal. And yet still God would bless the nation if the kings and the people would be sensitive to him and would have themselves devoted to him. They could expect peace, they could expect prosperity, they could expect his direction. And so we just see this throughout their history. Again, remembering that by this time the nation is split into two. And so you have the northern tribes of what we call Israel in the north, and then in the south you have Judah, comprised mainly of Judah and Benjamin. And again, there were crossovers, so you'd have people from different tribes living in different areas. But as far as the tribal allotments and who the king was over the particular tribal areas, it was the north, and then it was the south. So with all that being said, as we get to chapter 23, we're introduced to some people, and there's a lot of history in this that gets briefly mentioned here. But if you wanted to go back and look at it, it's in 2 Kings. It's basically from chapters 9 through 11, and that's kind of the parallel with this. If you go back and read those chapters, you're going to find that there is a good amount of detail given about the kings mainly in the north and the intrigues that were taking place there. So kind of an odd mix of people and an odd bit of history, much of which is not covered here in this part of Chronicles because it really concerns itself a bit more with the things happening up in the north. So with that being said, we make it to chapter 22, and we'll be doing chapter 22 and 23. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, as we come to you, we pray that you would give us understanding in your word, and that you would lead us, and that you would guide us in our knowledge and in our study of your word. We pray, God, that you'd be glorified through the teaching of your word in our hearing. We ask it in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 22 begins like this. So the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, the youngest son of the king, in his place, for the raiders who had come up from Arabia into the camp. They had killed all the sons of Ahaziah. So, all of his sons, rather. So Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, the king of Judah, reigned. Ahaziah was 42 years old when he became the king, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri, and he also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother advised him to do wickedly. Now, she's going to come back up in the next chapter quite a bit. Therefore, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, like the house of Ahab, for they were his counselors after the death of his father, to his destruction. So, what you have with Jehoram giving way to his son, once again, this you're going to find this happens a lot. The people that have the ear of the king can be a real benefit to them, or they can be just a genuine, even a gigantic, I was about to say, curse to these people. And so depending on the amount of influence, whether the king was going to be a man who could stand on his own and who would hear God's voice, as opposed to the person that could be completely manipulated by the people from the outside. Here is one of those cases, and of course he wasn't there for very long. It only tells us a year. But in the background, his mother is very much involved. So he also, verse 5, followed their advice, and he went with Jehoram, the son of Ahab, the king of Israel, to war against Hazael, the king of Syria, at Ramoth Gilead. Now, if you notice in the last chapters that we've studied up to this point, the king of Syria and Ramoth Gilead continues to be a place of contention, and it's a problem for the northern kings, and starting with Jehoshaphat really on down, for that short period of time, those kings would come to the assistance of the northern kings, with whom they should have no dealings. In fact, Jehoshaphat was really chastised for doing exactly that. The fact that he went to war with the north against Syria really should have cost him his life. God seems to have spared him, and yet he had to face the music, if you will, and God confronted him on it. Said, is this a right thing that you should do? Is it right that you should be, giving yourself and your assistance to people who are hostile and who hate God? That was the way he was addressed. So we find that there's a repeat of that. The mistakes of Jehoshaphat, and there are not good. The kings that followed him were not good kings, including him, and what is clearly not a succession of the kings from that point on. At least for the next, what we're going to see in chapter 23. Let me not get ahead of us. So it says he returned to Jezreel to recover from his wounds, because he was damaged in battle. We see that in verse 5. And so there are the two kings together. He returned to Jezreel to recover from his wounds, which he had received at Ramoth. And when he fought against Hazael, the king of Syria, and Azariah, the son of Jehoram, the king of Judah, went down to Jehoram, the son of Ahab, in Jezreel, because he was sick. So here is again the going between, if you will, of the king of the south in Judah going to the assistance, and there was the, again, familiar ties that there were between the north and the south, which really should have not existed at this point. Again, God is completely being rejected by the north, and in the south there were the kings. Some of the kings there were very much in the pattern of David, from, like I mentioned, Jehoshaphat, Asa before him, and so there should have been a solid group that should have continued all the way through Judah, and yet we would see that there was good and bad in them. Well, again, this is where maybe it wouldn't be a bad thing if you're interested in doing it, going back and looking at the parallels of this from chapter 9 through 11 in 2 Kings, because it'll give you a lot more of the backstory of the war that had taken place there. You're going to be introduced to another person who has a lot more being mentioned in Kings. I'll make reference to that when we get there. So what happens here, the northern king goes against Syria. He's wounded in battle, brought back to Jezreel, and as he's rehabilitating, now the southern king comes to see him. So we see in verse 7, his going to Joram was God's occasion for Azariah's downfall. So this is how God is going to begin to move again through the process of weeding out these kings in the south. And since this man is intent to go and check in on the northern king, God's is just going to make sure that this is where he comes to an end as well. Now remember, what we have in the north is, when you go and read those passages there, remember that by this time Ahab is dead. But God had already said to Ahab, you're not going to have any of your sons be able to sit on the throne. Basically, he had promised that his whole line would be wiped out, and including at a different time, it would be Jezebel. You get a lot more of that detail in 2 Kings, but that's the parallel time. It's the closing out of the family line of Ahab in the north, ultimately culminating with Jezebel, same way. So that's what we're looking at in the parallel of the history here. Now, verse 8. And so it happened, when Jehu was executing judgment on the house of Ahab. Jehu is the one that we're mentioning. Jehu's an interesting guy up in the north, anointed by Elijah to do this exact thing. And so he starts out in the way that he should, as a godly man, and does what we would think is a godly man. And he does all the things that Elijah had kind of tasked him to do, and that the Lord had designed for him to do. But in the end, he goes right back to his idolatry. Starts in the correct way, ends horribly. And so just a very, very interesting part of history. It is not in any real way covered here in Chronicles. It's really covered heavily in that passage there in 2 Kings. And so this is where it starts in 2 Kings in chapter 10, is where you get the interesting history about Jehu. So, again, verse 8. It happened when Jehu was executing judgment on the house of Ahab, and he found that the princes of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah's brothers who served Azariah, that he killed them. So it's kind of the cleaning of the house of all of the people that God was wanting to, if you will, have that line of those families brought to an end. And at this place, God is using Jehu, a man who ultimately rebels, but he still is the instrument that God uses to weed out all of the wickedness that had infested, really at this point, even the southern king, but mainly the north. And so again, read these as parallels if you really want to get the backstory. You can go back and see the studies that we did in 2 Samuel, either on the YouTube channel, or you can look back through the website that we have at Old Path Theology. We studied through these in detail as well. So with that being said, in verse 9, it says, then he searched, this is Jehu, then he searched for Azariah, and they caught him. He was hiding in Samaria. They brought him to Jehu, and when they had killed him, they buried him, because they said, he is the son of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all of his heart. And so the house of Azariah had no one to assume power over the kingdom. Now, we get the impression by just reading this that wherever it was that he died, that they just buried him there. All of this actually happened up in the north. But when you read through Kings, you see that even though he died in the north, they sent his body back to Jerusalem, because he's a descendant of Jehoshaphat. And at the time, Jehu was doing what was right before the Lord, what he was tasked to do through the ministry of Elijah. And this is why at the time, we don't want to dishonor this man, this descendant of Jehoshaphat, who was a righteous man, even though his in this case, grandson, is not a good guy. So they send him back. Again, he's then buried in what is Jerusalem. You get that again from 2 Kings. So it tells us now, when Athaliah, his mother, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all of the royal heirs of the house of Judah. So see, this is what had happened before, if you remember this. And this guy had already killed his brothers. Now his mother is getting rid of anybody else of the line so that there would be nobody to rival her. So again, think about this, how far it has gone. From David, the man that God had appointed, the man to whom he gave all of the promises and said, yours will be an established kingdom, I will establish it forever. And God, knowing when he made the promise that there would be this whole line of just horrible kings, he knew that that line would ultimately be cut off and it would not exist. And so from the time that the last of the kings in the south, during and after the Babylonian captivity, they were kind of figurehead at that point anyway, but they never had a king from that point on. Even to this day, they do not have a king of a direct descendant of David. And yet God made that as a forever promise. Well, Jesus, being from Judah, of David's line, directly a descendant of David, is the one who will become the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords in Jerusalem and in the forever kingdom as well. So that promise that was given to David fell very, very short in the humans that were after his time, but the promise was a forever king, and Jesus fits that bill perfectly. So just we're seeing it play out in the human side of it, and it doesn't take very many generations for it to go from David, again, the ideal, to Solomon, and there's a degrading from David to Solomon, and from Solomon's time, after he had died, then the nation split between his son in the south and then Jeroboam in the north, and then never recovers. So with all of that being said, now you have a woman who basically says, my son is now died, and I'm going to take out everybody that could possibly be the ones who might be able to assume his position as king. So she thinks basically she kills her way to her position. So Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead. She arose, destroyed all the royal heirs of the house of Judah. But Jehoshabeth, the daughter of the king, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, stole him away from among the king's sons who were being martyred, and she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. So Jehoshabeth, the daughter of the king Jehoram, the wife of Jehoiada the priest, for he was the sister of Azariah, and she hid him from Athaliah so that he did not kill him. So again, this is the sister who takes away the child. She's actually married to the high priest, and so they make sure that there's still one from the line of the kings, and so this child is hidden at a very young age, hidden away. So it says in verse 12, and so he was hidden with them in the house of God for 6 years. So of course an infant, because when he becomes king, as we're going to see in this chapter coming up, 23, he's only 7 years when he begins to reign. And boy, if this is another, again, case study, as chapter 22 was a case study in how far they had fallen as the kings, this is a case study in what happens of who it is that will be the one that God uses to minister to someone and to give them advice, but it also shows how quickly people can be manipulated in the wrong way, for sure. We would hope that if a child was given very godly instructions by godly people, that instruction would go from the time that they were young to when they come of age and mature, that they would take that on themselves and walk accordingly. You would hope that that was the case, but it doesn't turn out that way with Jehoiada. So, in chapter 23, in the 7th year of Jehoiada, He strengthened himself and made a covenant with the captains of the hundreds. And I just misspoke. It's not Jehoiada. Jehoiada is not going to be the king. Jehoiada is the priest who he ends up putting in place is Joash, the son. So remember, Joash, when he was first taken in by the high priest, was a year old. Now all of this is taking place while at the time that he becomes 7. So they had him away for 6 years. So in the 7th year of Jehoiada, he strengthened himself and made a covenant with all the captains of the hundreds. Azariah, the son of Jehoram, Ishmael, the son of Jehohanan, Azariah, the son of Obed, Messiah, the son of Adiah, and Elishaphat, the son of Zichri. Now, they do that just to torture us that aren't really good at Hebrew names. So in verse 2, and so they went throughout Judah. They gathered the Levites from all the cities of Judah and the chief fathers of Israel, and they came to Jerusalem. So you see kind of what would be a move back towards the way that things ought to be. By this time, it had become increasingly wicked under this mother. Her son before her was a wicked, an evil man. And so the nation begins to go that way. But what you find here is that there are priests and that there are people of prominence, if you will, who don't want anything to do with the way that things are supposed to be, let alone the mother of the last king, who was a wicked man. What you find here is that things had become very, very bad very, very quickly with the idolatry that was taking place and all of the wickedness that was rampant throughout the south, and it doesn't take long. Again, this is a really important thing for us to understand. Why in the churches, if we ever see anything come into the church that even seems in any way of compromise or wickedness, it needs to be completely removed. It needs to be cut out and taken away. It can't be allowed to continue. It will fester and it will grow and it will corrupt, and it will do so exponentially. So it's important for us to remember that at all times, as far as the church is concerned, we can learn from this. It doesn't take long for corruption to completely permeate and begin to take over. It happened in the nation. And as far as Israel's concerned, we see it happen again and again and again. It only would really take a matter of one king to a next. In a matter of just a few years, it can go from being what it's supposed to be to something that's unrecognizable and wicked. And so that's what had become of Judah. So it tells us in verse 3, so all the assembly made a covenant with the king in the house of the Lord. And he said to them, behold, the king's son shall reign, as the Lord has said to the sons of David. This is what you will do. 1/3 of you entering on the Sabbath of the priests and of the Levites, you shall be keeping watch over the doors. They're making this look as though it's just another day. Remember, they did what they did in shifts. And so the priests and the servants would be coming in shifts. They're not there 24 hours a day. They rest. So they come in their groups. And this would look kind of like a normal thing, though he's made the promise here. There's a descendant, and we want to make him king. It's time to overthrow the wickedness that's taking place. This woman has no place in being the queen, in this case, over the nation, or the ruler over this nation. She's a usurper, she's a murderer, she's just an opportunist who doesn't even know that there is still a descendant of her son. And so this is the one that they're going to be putting up there. So what they need to do is make sure that he is safeguarded, as he has been all along, but they're going to make him king, and they do so in a forceful way that brings the people out, and they are going to agree upon this. That puts her in the place of being on the outside, and we'll see what takes place with her. Again, let's remember, this is God judging this woman and the condition of the things in the south, but he's doing it through godly people, the high priest in this case, and the people who would answer to him who were of like mind. So, verse 4, and he says, this is what you will do. 1/3 of you will be entering on the Sabbath of the priests and of the Levites. They shall be keeping watch over the doors. 1/3 will be at the king's house, 1/3 at the gate of the foundation, and all the people shall be in the courts of the house of the Lord. But let no one come into the house of the Lord except for the priests and those of the Levites who serve, which is the way it's supposed to be. They may go in, for they are holy, but all the people shall keep the watch of the Lord. And the Levites shall surround the king on all sides, every man with his weapon in his hand, and whoever comes into the house, let him be put to death. You are to be with the king when he comes in and when he goes out. So these will be the personal guard of the king, because it's about to be a time of upheaval and tumult, though it doesn't really appear that way among the people. But it is, they understand her and his, in this case, his grandmother is a treacherous, evil, wicked woman, and there are those who would be supporting of her, especially the idolatrous priests and all the people who are doing these wicked things right there in Jerusalem. It just tells you the struggle that's going on. Once again, your reference is, you can go back and you can take a look at what it has to say of this whole era. Basically, it's chapters 9 and 10 and 11 of 2 Kings. Now, in verse 8, so the Levites and all of Judah did according to all that Jehoiada the priest had commanded, and each man took his men, and these ones who were to be on duty on the Sabbath, with those who were going off duty on the Sabbath, for Jehoiada the priest had not dismissed the divisions. So as it looks like there is a changing over, Jehoiada stops it and makes sure that you've got basically double what you would have. But these are all people who are willing to serve what the priest has to say. But most importantly, because of who the king is, these are men who would be loyal to that part. So in verse 9, and Jehoiada the priest gave to the captains of the hundreds, he gave to them spears, large and small shields, which had belonged to King David, that were in the temple of God. And there he set all the people, every man with his weapon in his hands, from the right side of the temple to the left side of the temple, along the altar, by the temple, and all around the king. So everywhere that you would expect for them to be found is precisely where they are. And there's a reason why, because they're about to make a very public announcement. So what you would expect is the mother to come out there, and she's going to hear the commotion, she's going to see what's going on or hear what's going on, and they want to be ready and prepared in case there is any kind of conflict. So set the people, every man with his weapon in his hand. And then verse 11 it says, and so they brought out the king's son, put the crown on him, and gave him the testimony, made him the king. Then Jehoiada and his sons anointed him and said, long live the king. Now in this there's an interesting thing here. It says that they put a crown upon his head, which was a recognition of him being in the succession of the kings. But this testimony, it's a place of a little bit of debate, or it's a matter of a little bit of debate. The explanations of what the testimony is ranges from written documents that were part of it, and some would say even attached to the crown itself, which could be something as simple as the commandments, could be the entire law of God, or it could be, some believe that it's an oath, that the people would pledge allegiance to him and he would align himself with them, saying the things that he would do. That's just some of the speculations of what exactly this is. There are those also who believe that this is a mistranslation, because a very similar word also could be translated as bracelets. And so things that would be adornments, if you will, in addition to the crown. So people of good scholarship take a number of different views of what this might be. All that to say, if you have that varying degree of disagreement on what exactly this means, it means we have not been given enough information to say absolutely this is what it is. So there's no sense in being contentious over it. We just say it's something that was also in addition to the crown, but it was definitely something that would make it obvious who he is, what he's supposed to do. Remember, he's 7 years old at this point. And there's something that's really interesting that is said about him. We're going to get to it here in just a moment. So, in verse 12, so when Athaliah, that's the grandmother at this point, heard the noise of the people running and praising the king, she came to the people in the temple of the Lord. And when she looked, there was the king standing by the pillar at the entrance, and the leaders of the trumpeters were by the king. All the people of the land were rejoicing, blowing trumpets, also the singers and the musical instruments, and those who led in praise. And so Athaliah tore her clothes and said, treason. She cries out treason. So the thing is, this is a rightful heir and a descendant, and the people are stirred to the place of recognition. And so here she sees there's no hope for her. She cries treason, but who's listening? So what she's brought is such a bad condition in the nation that people are ready to move on from her. She shouldn't be there in the first place. She murdered her way into the position, and now God is bringing about the judgment upon her, not just because of how she took over, and not just because she murdered to get her way there. I mean, she's killing her people in her own family to get to that point, but her son did the same exact thing. So she was one who had been very instrumental in the wickedness happening with her son and then in the nation, and had murdered after that other people who could have been rivals to her. By this time, they'd started to implement the same paganism that God had already judged, and so you can see it was a pretty desperate, pretty ugly, kind of a wicked time in Jerusalem, and God was purging all of the stuff that was taking place there. So Jehoiada the priest brought out the captains of the hundreds who were set over the army, and he said to them, take her outside under guard, slay her with the sword, whoever follows her. For the priest said, do not kill her in the house of the Lord, which is, don't shed blood in here, but don't let her live. She's being judged. And so they seized her, and they went out by way of the entrance of the horse gate into the king's house, and they killed her there. So that would be, best as we can tell, the horse gate is pretty widely regarded as kind of the southeastern exit out of the complex there, and then taking her down into the lower part of the mountain, what they called down towards the where David, the house of the city of David is. So to the south of the temple, out into that area, there was a gate that led out from the temple complex, and they didn't want her anywhere in that whole area. She was to be killed outside of the temple area. So it said now in verse 16, so Jehoiada made a covenant between himself, between the people and the king, that they should be the Lord's people. Now here is the influence. Again, he's a 7-year-old child, so it's not as though he's going to be a king who is able to handle things. And so you could say almost by default or de facto, Jehoiada kind of served more as the king, at least in the way that things were done. Because again, the king is generally who he is, but he's 7 years old. So the idea that he could lead a nation, not really at this point. But God gives to him a very godly man in Jehoiada to be that one who would lead him. Look at what it says. It's very interesting. And it will help us understand as we get into the next chapter. So, Jehoiada made a covenant between himself, the people, and the king, that they should be the Lord's people. All the people went to the temple of Baal, and they tore it all down. They broke into pieces the altars and the images, and they killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. Now remember, this is happening in the areas of Jerusalem. So the idea that you had idol worship and really worship of demons right there in the house, in the city rather, the city of David, it's an amazing thing to consider that it had become that bad that quick. So remember, Jerusalem is the heart of the nation, and it is where the temple was built. It should be the cleanest and most holy of all places, and you have idol worship happening right there that they went out and just stomped right away. It shows how quickly they would come into corruption. It was just an amazing thing. So Jehoiada appointed the oversight of the house of the Lord to the hand of the priests and the Levites, and those whom David had assigned to the house of the Lord to offer the burnt offering of the Lord, as it is written in the law of Moses, and rejoicing and singing as it was established by David. So this is the wonderful thing about it. By the time that David becomes the king, the law is already there. So knowing what they're supposed to be doing on a daily basis, remember that goes all the way back to the tabernacle in the wilderness. So from the time of the Exodus on, they are given the law and the sacrifices for their whole time in the wilderness, those 40 years. They've come into the land and they have had their time of kind of nomadic life. But now here they are situated in Jerusalem. There is a permanent temple that's been put up by Solomon, and all that they're doing is putting back the things as they are supposed to. And once Solomon had built the temple under his, remember it was David who had put the priests over these things. This was all part of that design, David into Solomon's time. They're only going back to what should have been going on all along. That's what we're reading here. So it's a putting things back into their proper order. So verse 18, so he appointed oversight of the house to the priests, to the Levites, as David had assigned. And then in verse 19, and then he set the gatekeepers at the gates of the house of the Lord, so that no one who was in any way unclean should enter. So you're going from a place of complete corruption in the previous king, and then into the time of his mother. All of this, the idea that they're having to reinstitute it means it had been broken down in these previous years. So it went, think about what it was like during Jehoshaphat's time, and it didn't take long for it to get to this kind of a condition. It's just an amazing thing. So at this point, they're putting back things the way that they should have been all along. Verse 20, he took the captains of the hundreds, he took the nobles, the governors of the people, and all the people of the land, and he brought the king down from the house of the Lord. And so they went through the upper gate to the king's house, and they set the king in the throne of the kingdom. So this is everything put back as it's supposed to be. There's a purging that has taken place of Athaliah and all who were with her. It's a scrubbing, if you will, of all of that corruption, not only of the people, but also of the formal worship that was going on that they were participating in. It's now gone. Look at this. So it says, so all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet, for they had slain Athaliah with the sword. She was the source of all of the problem. Now let's make sure we're careful, because people would not just do this if they didn't have license to do it. So all of the idolatrous priests, all of the people who were worshiping the foreign gods and all the rest of that, it's one thing if they're given the ability to do it, but they still had to be participants. That stuff was all, it really had its foundation in her, and the people would follow it because she facilitated it. She's gone, no more facilitation of that. They're even putting to death those priests, rightfully so, as God would have had them do. But it just also shows you that you can't always just put it on the leadership, because the people have to have a willingness to do this kind of wickedness. So really sad to see. Notice this as we look just at the first couple of verses of chapter 24, because I find it really interesting. And it shows, as I said at the beginning, with Joash, I get it, he's a 7-year-old child, but he's going to reign for 40 years. And what you'll find in his time, from his youth, his childhood, in through his adolescence and then into his adulthood, he's had Jehoiada there for the whole time. And he's been this godly influence, this godly presence. But look at what it says happens. Joash was 7 years old when he became the king. He reigned for 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. That gives you a glimpse into what's about to happen. So it's going to be a very brief recall of his history, but as long as the influence was there, then he would be guided to do that. But it shows that even in his adult years, again into his he's 47 by the time he's gone, But Jehoiada was there for the most all of his life. It was only after Jehoiada dies that he's left on his own to make his own decisions, and the things that he was led to do seems to have never really taken root in his heart because he becomes wicked in the end. It's just such an interesting thing to consider that, yeah, we can have people around us who are of great influence to us in the spiritual sense, but ultimately we have to stand on our own at some point. And in this case, when he's left to stand on his own, he diverts right back to the same wickedness. It's a sad, sad statement. And but it does also make us realize that nobody is saved because of their parents or because of whoever else is there. Every person needs to stand before God on their own and be made right before him, or they will have to be a person judged for who and what they are. So this is covered very, very thoroughly in these in the chapter after this. You really get a chance to see the difference of when many of the decisions were kind of made for him in his early life, but that's not to excuse the fact that when he had a chance to do it himself, he reverted back to just the way that things were seemingly, and all of the good decisions that seemed to happen under his reign as king were really being influenced by godly people, and he never had that same walk that a man like him should have had. So a sad part of the history of the kings of Judah. We'll pick up at chapter 24 next week, and if you have any questions about what we've covered, please contact us through the church or the ministry website, I should say, and it is at oldpaththeology.net. We pick up at chapter 24, and we're really starting to work towards the latter chapters of this. The rest of the line of the Kings goes pretty quickly if you think about it, because there's a lot of history to cover, but not a lot of chapters. So the closing chapters of 2 Chronicles are fascinating, again, because it really is going to kind of recount for us historically the last of the kings of Judah, and it's going to be in next week, I believe it's next week's chapter, it's going to bring a close to the kings of the north, and so then everything from that point on is going to be exclusively about the kings of the south. So we'll pick up there next week in chapter 24, and if there again are any questions, please contact us through the email part of the website. And you're always free to go ahead and make comments in the YouTube page. We leave those comment sections open, so you can make comment there. If you haven't subscribe to the page. Again, working on content, working on podcast, and a few other things. Also an email list so we can keep you in the know on things happening around ministry. And if you haven't done so, you can contact us once again through that email and ask to be added to the mail list, which will be getting sent out here pretty quick. We're getting ready to head off to Israel, so there's a lot of things going on right now. There's a conference at the end of this month. As I record this, it is April of 22, and at the last weekend of April, I'll be up in Appleton, Wisconsin. There's a really good conference going on there. If you want to go check it out, you can go to the website at Calvary Chapel of Appleton and look up their conference at the end of April, and they'll be live streaming it. Take the time over that weekend and watch the sessions. They're going to be really good. A lot of discussion of things happening around our world and even around the church, dealing with prophetic times in which we live. And so if you want to kind of get a good snapshot of where we are in the world and things happening around it that have prophetic implications, you might find that to be a very helpful conference. So until next week, pray that God blesses the time that you spend in His Word and that you would grow in your knowledge of Him.